I want to thank everyone for their presentation so far. It's been really amazing to hear from everyone. And I look forward to some connections moving forward with a few of you. I will be speaking on community-based water quality monitoring at Garden River First Nation, but I am not a member of the community. I'm not Indigenous, and so I will be speaking from a settler's perspective, although I was involved in the creation of this project. But given tonight's theme, I will first spend a few minutes speaking to some of the changes that we've seen since our first lockdown in the spring of 2020, and these are just really high level. I'm not going to any extensive detail on these. First being that, as we know, virtual meetings and classes were at the time the way to interact, and that's kind of opened up a whole new door in many ways. And thank you for to the previous speakers who have touched on this. You saved me about 2 minutes of speaking. In some ways, this has required a lot more from us. So as an example, I taught a field ecology course last year that is meant to be taught in the field, where students would do things like measuring diameters of trees and sampling streams and things like that. We had to convert that to an online format. And so this was a very big challenge, but we ended up forming a team of several interdisciplinary individuals who then worked together to create, for example, virtual realities using ArcGIS and things like that. So although the challenge was presented, it has forced us in some ways to realize how much we need each other in different disciplines and forced us to work together in different ways. And then our students also benefited by learning skills they wouldn't have, for example, using mapping tools in different ways than they typically do. And then, of course, the equity action in some areas, more rapid connectivity improvements, which, as mentioned, have allowed people to access more services and some people to access services they haven't had access to, accessing education, information, work opportunities also. And so that also ties into the collaboration platforms that have exploded since then, both in popularity and functionality. And that has also allowed us to work together in different ways than were previously possible and from different locations, which removes a lot of limitations that were previously in place from conventional ways of working together. Work environments were also humanizing, are continuing to humanize. So people have put a new focus on wellness, general wellness of individuals, and employers are recognizing more formally that workers are people too, and the workplace isn't the most important thing in their lives. And there's also the idea that work-life balance means that you have to recognize that life doesn't just happen outside of the 9-to-5 workday, right? So all of these things together have created more flexible work and study environments, but also more flexible ways for people to be able to interact with each other for any purpose, whether it's family connecting overseas or whatever the case may be. So I'm speaking mostly from an Ontario perspective in terms of timelines, but a lot of these changes are also reflected globally. However, in addition to the opportunities that have been coming with these changes, there's also many social, political, and economic objectives and agendas that were impacted generally negatively by the pandemic, which in my mind can kind of be collectively framed within the Sustainable Development Goals framework. So I'll kind of use that framework here to go through some of those. Progress reversed in a few areas, obviously good health and well-being for obvious reasons, that's SDG 3. Inclusive and equitable quality education, SDG 4, which is what we're concerned with in the academic field, in many places across the world went backwards for reasons including young people who were typically going to be students were then seeking out opportunities to create an income for their families because older relatives, whether it's parents or other relatives, either fell ill or passed away as a result of the pandemic. So that changed the family dynamic. And then, of course, SDG 5, as some people are aware, domestic violence has increased significantly across the globe as a result of international shutdowns or lockdowns. So gender equality, SDG 5, which incorporates those targets, has also been put backwards. So this is not just obviously a local issue. It manifests in all kinds of different ways across the planet. But SDG 6 was in many ways at the heart of the pandemic, and that was clean water and sanitation for all. And so we know that one of the best ways, or one of the key ways of preventing or slowing the spread of the pandemic has been to wash your hands and keep your work and living environments clean and sanitized and whatnot. And this is not possible if you don't have access to reliable, clean sources of water. And that goes along with many social economic issues that are tied into that. And so this brings me back full circle to the topic that I'm speaking to today, but also doesn't surprise me that all three of the panelists here tonight work in some capacity with water issues, as these kinds of challenges have become more stark throughout the pandemic. And so the context for freshwater that I'm speaking to, and also relevant to tonight's theme, is in regards to the St. Mary's River area of concern, which you can see on the map outlined in red. If you're not familiar with the Great Lakes areas of concern, they are regions across the Great Lakes that have experienced high levels of environmental harm as designated by the 1987 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was reaffirmed in 2012. There were originally 43 such areas identified, most of which were in the United States, 12 are in Canada, and 5 were binational, including the St. Mary's River. And although a few areas have been delisted, so they have been determined to have improved significantly to the point where they're no longer considered degraded, some of these areas are beginning to revert back to a degraded state. And so the idea with projects like the one that we've pursued is to be able to ensure that progress being made is going to remain progress and is not going to be basically canceled out by any future actions, right, that we can foresee. In the social context, exclusion of the First Peoples in stewardship and decision-making processes regarding waters across the Great Lakes region has been practiced essentially since settlers came here. And so given all the other parts of the context of our social environment, this is no longer acceptable. And so this is another issue or another aspect of the project that is being highlighted in this presentation tonight as well. And so the project was co-created with Garden River First Nation from the very beginning. The point about why I, as a settler, came into the community to do this project is a really good one, and I'd be happy to speak to that in the Q&A if it's of interest to anyone. 10 organizations made this possible, obviously Garden River First Nation, as well as the NORDIK Institute, Algoma University, Waterlution, Swim Drink Fish, Water Rangers, the Gordon Foundation, who also runs the Great Lakes data stream that I'll speak to in a moment, as well as the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, MyTax, and Eco-Canada. So what we did during the pilot season, which occurred over this past summer, and we're currently modifying the program and evaluating it to create a more permanent version for implementation starting next year, is we used Water Rangers Freshwater Explorer test kits to measure 9 parameters, and from conductivity we also converted the number to total dissolved solids for a 10th parameter. We had 7 sites. 3 of them we monitored for the full duration of 15 weeks, and then 4 of them were added a little bit late, so there's only 13 weeks of data for those. We also did benthos surveys twice in the fall, and benthos are the little bugs that live in the sediment at the bottom of the stream. And then we are currently in the process of setting up an E. coli laboratory supported by Swim Drink Fish that is going to allow Garden River First Nation to be a hub, essentially, of water quality testing for Indigenous communities across the region without having to rely on any outside sources to provide that service to them. And so with regards to Great Lakes data stream, what we do when we collect our data is we upload it to the Water Rangers application or web portal. It is openly accessible like DataStream is, and what happens is the Water Rangers portal integrates automatically with Great Lakes DataStream. So Great Lakes DataStream is one of 4 data streams across the country. It just launched in October, but it already has partnerships with 23, I believe, different monitoring organizations, including government agencies, that collectively represent over 21,000 monitoring sites and over 7 million data points. So if you look at this map, you'll see the St. Mary's River area of concern, or St. Mary's River towards the left, and then we're getting into the North Channel of Lake Huron to the lower right. And our sites are highlighted in red there, and that overlay map is a screenshot from the Water Rangers app. That's why it looks a little different. But you can see they're located fairly centrally in the St. Mary's River. And if you look at all the other dots around them, one of the issues is that a lot of the data, if you go into DataStream, you can actually click there and see who does the monitoring and what years the data span. A lot of them stopped in the 1980s. And this was primarily due to funding cuts at the government level in terms of actually going out and collecting the data. So the data that we're collecting right now is some of the more updated information available across the region, at least on the Canadian side. Bay Mills Indian community to the south also has been collecting a large amount of data for more than 20 years, and we're in communication right now about sharing some of that information across the border. But another thing that is of use in the data stream platform, which we've also been in conversation with Bay Mills about, is the data visualization tool. And this is one of the things that's come out of this pandemic, is the use of a lot of these platforms for collaboration in different ways than have previously been planned for. So you have, for example, dissolved oxygen is one of the things that we've collected. And you can see those different colored dots are for different sites that we've measured at. Those lines across the screen show different levels for different cold or warm water biota and which life stages they're at, in terms of what level is required for them to be comfortable versus showing stress from too low oxygen. And so we had no idea before doing this that many of our sites were below the threshold for cold water biota in early life stages, including cold water fishes that would be spawning in the area. But of more concern was that 2 of our sites were consistently below the threshold for all freshwater biota at all life stages. So this was a concern that was not known in the community previously, but information like this and is easily understood by graphs like that can be interpreted by anyone who can log into the system using the internet for any of the data points across the whole Great Lakes region. And so the virtual platforms like this mean that the world is not so small after all. So you have more reach. As an example, we presented at the International River Symposium this fall, which is one of the largest freshwater conferences in the world and takes place in Australia, in Brisbane, I believe, every year. As a result of the pandemic, last year they held their first online offering of the conference, and this year, because of the success of the online offering, they have a hybrid format that they're carrying forward permanently now. And so because of the pandemic instigating this shift, they have opened up this audience, and we would not otherwise have been able to participate in such a forum with so much reach of people from around the world without the pandemic having caused this shift. But in addition, the platforms that are online like this allow us to know things we otherwise wouldn't. So you can go out there and say, well, I don't know who's doing what in the area. How do I figure that out? But when you look at a map like you saw in the previous slide, you can click any of the data points and see which organizations relate to which data points. And so it helps you understand what the picture is in that sense. And so one of the 5 main reasons that I wanted to highlight that is important to me and to this project in terms of these online collaborations and these platforms is that we're able to coordinate better across different communities and across different programs. So we've been in conversation with Batchewana First Nation and Missinati Cree about potentially forming similar community-based water quality monitoring programs in their communities. They've approached us with interest. And so having a platform like this allows us to coordinate with them and with others, for example, with Bay Mills, to make sure that we're all collecting the same kind of data so that a coherent story can be told across the region rather than everybody collecting different information. From this collaboration, it's made more possible. And so in addition to identifying who is in the area, what they're collecting, and making sure that everything aligns, it's a lot easier to make those connections in terms of reaching out, because the contact information is also there to be able to build those relationships or start those relationships and work together. And it also allows general members of the community to engage in this kind of information and work, so that if you're trying to get more people involved, they can actually understand the information more, which brings me to the 3rd point on education. So anybody in the community can log in at any time and see what the current state of data is. But it's also useful at a post-secondary level or public school level even, because people can or instructors can use the data that comes out of these, download the data sets and provide them to students in whatever, whether it's full form or if you take an excerpt of it for analysis in a real world scenario in a context that matters to them. Of course, the idea is you'd want a management response of some kind. So something like what we found with the dissolved oxygen shows us that there are issues that we didn't know about, and that's something that now we're able to have discussions about how we can respond to or how we can address. So when you have multiple organizations monitoring across a site that are collecting their own data, sometimes you don't necessarily see the impacts of an issue unless you get a cumulative picture of what's going on across the region, and then you can pinpoint where the stressors might be identified. And then finally, democratization, as has been touched on by others, and I'm sure will be touched on by at least one of the other two panelists here tonight. The idea behind agency, as has been mentioned already, and allowing or empowering, excuse my language, community members to access information, understand that information, and then share that information and potentially act on it is a big deal, and is not something that has been enabled as easily in the past as now that everything is being more open sourced and provided in an online format. So I don't want to take up any more time from any of the other speakers. I'll leave it at that. But if anyone wants to explore any of these topics more in depth, I would love to connect with anyone. Thank you.